Chapter 20. The next day our posters are up all over the walls, and they stay up. No dolphins this time. Our symbol has become a name in a circle with a line slashed through it. This is what one of the posters looks like. Vote for the no-name party. End name-calling once and for all. President, Addie Carl. Vice President, Joe Bunch. Treasurer, Bobby Goodspeed. Secretary, Skeezy Tukas. Loser. Sticks and stones may break our bones, but names will break our spirit. You might figure, we did anyway, that putting our names out there like that, especially with certain choice epithets right underneath them, would make us setting targets for ridicule. But it doesn't happen. I mean, what can anybody say that just doesn't prove our point? Even Kevin Hennessy is at a loss for words. All he can come up with is, "What's the matter? Did you run out of whales to save?" Not exactly amaterial, even for him. Between science and math, Darrell Williams smiles at me in the hall. I want to tell him how he was the inspiration for the whole thing, but I don't want to embarrass him, so I just smile back. In art class on Friday, Colin tells Joe and me that he thinks what we're doing is the best thing that ever happened at PFMS. He means it, and that Addie is amazing, and then he turns to Joe and goes, "Hey, we're running against each other for vice president. Is it bad if I vote for you?" And Joe blushes on every part of him that shows. This gets me feeling sorry for Joe and wondering what Colin would do if he knew Joe liked him. I decide that after about the age of 3, life is not simple. Which reminds me. On Thursday, Joe gets another note from Kelsey in his locker. It says, "Meet me at the flagpole after school." To which Addie goes, "At least she could be original." She owns up to having told Kelsey about meeting Colin there on Tuesday and how they're going out together now. If she's looking to spread gossip, Kelsey the Silent is the wrong person to tell. Anyway, Joe begs Addie and me to go with him to the flagpole after school on account of Skeezy is unavailable and Joe does not want to be a creep and not show up. Besides which, he figures he has to tell her to her face that he does not want to go out with her, and he needs our support. He thinks he is doing some kind of community service or something when he turns to me and says, "And if you're there, Bobby, you can walk her home and console her, and then maybe she'll decide she likes you." Great idea, I tell him. I can be like the year's supply of steak sauce they give you when you don't win the sports car. It turns out that Joe does not have to tell her anything, and I do not have to be the steak sauce, because Kelsey chickens out and doesn't show. Leastwise, that is what we figure. What happens is that we go to the flagpole after school and wait until all of a sudden Addie spots Colin and goes, "Ooh, my boyfriend," and runs off. At which point I turn to Joe and make some comment along the lines of, "I hope Addie's brain does not completely rot out on us before the election." And Joe says, "Do you think Colin is going to start hanging out with us?" To which I shrug because I do not have an answer. Joe watches Colin and Addie walk away, and I almost, but don't, reach over and rub him on the top of his head, because he reminds me of one of those puppies who looks up at you at the pet store with its big sad eyes, just begging you to take it home with you, but nobody does. It's bad enough to watch Joe being miserable and Addie being happy, even though I can't help wondering how seriously Colin takes his relationship with Addie, or if he even knows he has one. To make matters worse, I find this scrap of paper after art class on Friday when I am on cleanup. It is all crumpled up, and for some reason I do not know the meaning of, I uncrumple it, and there I discover the initials BC inside a heart. I do not think anything of this until, upon closer inspection, I see that the C is a G, and I am all of a sudden confronted with the mystery of who in my art class likes me, because of course I am figuring these to be my initials. I'm wishing it is Kelsey, but I know it is not, so I get to casting my eyes around the room without being too obvious about it, when Mr. Manelli calls, "Looking for something, Bobby?" And I drop all these scraps of paper on the floor and sputter some kind of answer that must be pretty funny, because it gets a lot of people laughing, but for the life of me, I have no idea what it is I said. Walking to my job, I contemplate life in a monastery. I think at least I won't have to deal with Mr. Kellerman today because his mother just died, and why would he not give himself a few days off to feel sad in the privacy of his own home? That is the normal course of things, I figure. But Mr. K is not your normal individual, so not only is he there when I step into the department to select my neckwear for the next 2 hours, but he greets me with a snappish, "You are 5 minutes late, Mr. Goodspeed." I have not given a whole lot of thought to what I would say to Mr. Kellerman the next time I saw him. I know I should say something about his mother dying, along the lines of, "I'm sorry your mother died." That's just good form. But his jabbing at me about being late does not leave me much room for wanting to be nice. So I just mumble "sorry" under my breath, grab a tie, and head to the stockroom to put it on. For the next hour, Mr. Kellerman hardly says a word to me. Mostly he fusses with piles of clothes the way he usually does, muttering under his breath and glancing up at the clock. I glance there too, from time to time, because it is natural that I am eager for my break to arrive, especially as today has been another no-show day in terms of customers. As I see the big hand about to hit the 12, I am all set to say, "I'm going for a break," when it occurs to me that Mr. Kellerman is nowhere in sight. And at the same moment, who should appear but a customer? He's a man about my grandfather's age, or maybe older. He squints at me as if he has never seen a 12-year-old tie salesman before, which I venture to say he has not. And when I ask if I may be of assistance, as per page something or other of the 6 stapled pages, he looks around as if trying to spot the spaceship in which I arrived. "You're awfully young," he goes. I acknowledge the truth of what he is saying, but tell him that I am trained and ready to be of service. "Usually Mr. Kellerman helps me," he grumbles, letting me know that the service I am trained and ready to provide will not be required. "I'll go get him," I say, and then think to ask the man his name. "Mr. Mars," he says. I think this is pretty funny, having just had the alien thing going on in my head, but I keep my amusement to myself. The stockroom is eerily silent. Every time I put my foot down, the floor creaks. "Mr. Kellerman?" I go in a hushed voice like I just stepped into an alternate universe. The theme to the Blair Witch Project starts playing in my head. I've not seen the Blair Witch Project, so I do not know if, in fact, what I am hearing is the theme, but I imagine this is what it must sound like, this creepy music I've got going in my cranium as I make my way down shadowy aisles, piled high with boxes, breathlessly anticipating some lunatic with hollow eyes and an axe jumping out at me at any moment. I'm wondering if my mother's mind worked the way mine does, and if that's why she was an actress, and what I will be. That is, if I survive the attack of the murderous fiend who is lurking behind the men's dress shirts, sizes 15.5 to 17, to my right. As it turns out, there is no murderous fiend lurking there, but there is someone. He does not hear me at first, just as I do not hear him. His back is to me, his left hand stretched out to hold onto a shelf, his right hand dangling at his side. If I didn't know it was Mr. Kellerman, I might really be spooked, on account of that creepy music going in my mind a few minutes back, because the way he is bent forward, he almost looks headless. I clear my throat and say, "Mr. Kellerman?" He jumps a little at the sound of my voice, but doesn't turn to face me. "What are you doing here?" he says. "We can't both be on break at the same time. You should be out on the floor." "I know that, Mr. Kellerman, but there's a man, a customer." "Well, take care of him!" he barks at me. "But he asked for you, Mr. Kellerman. It's Mr. Mars." Mr. Kellerman heaves a big sigh and slowly turns around. "Fine," he says. "Fine. Take your break, Mr. Goodspeed." It does not get any better the rest of the day. He hardly speaks to me, and I do not know how to tell him I am sorry his mother died. The way he is acting, I'm wondering if it's even true. All I know is that I have never been so glad to hear the voice say, "Shoppers, the store will be closing in 15 minutes. When the doors do close, I'm ready to hightail it out of there, but Mr. Kellerman surprises me. "May I walk with you a ways, Mr. Goodspeed?" he asks. "You live in Shadow Glen, I believe. I am on Fairlawn, just 2 blocks from you." I cannot see any way out of this, so I say okay, and I figure he must have his reasons. All I hope is that he's not hiding an axe up his sleeve. As we walk in silence, he finally blurts out, "I want to apologize for my behavior today." That's okay, I go. No, it is not okay. I have behaved badly toward you since you began working at Awkworth and Ames, and today was the worst. I have been under a great deal of stress, but that is no excuse for incivility. Honest, I say, it's okay. I mean, I know, well, I'm sorry about your mom, dying and all. Thank you, Mr. Kellerman says. There is something in his voice that is different, like he is opening a door to a room inside himself that no one goes in usually, and he's asking me to step inside and take a seat. My mom died too, I tell him. I know, he says back, which surprises me at first, but then I remember it's a small town, and my dad did work at Awkworth and Ames for a while, back in his drinking days. We are quiet for a few minutes then, except for the sound of our feet hitting the pavement. How do you survive it? He asks at last. What? I say. I wonder how I will survive it. Before I can say anything, not that I know what to say, he starts pouring words out like they've been living in this room just waiting for a visitor. I guess I was always something of a mama's boy, he says. She was terribly protective of me, which I resented when I was young, but I can't blame her. How could I, knowing there was another child, a baby named Patrick, before I was born. He died of crib death at 4 weeks of age. Can you imagine? That's not even a life. When I came along, she hovered over me and fretted about every little sniffle. I have no doubt she checked on me every night to make sure I was still breathing. Probably right up until the time I left home for college. At school, not college, of course, but elementary school, and what grade are you in? 7th, I tell him. Ah, yes. Well, all the way through high school, really, I was made fun of. Mama's boy, sissy. I came home crying so many afternoons. And she would stroke my hair and tell me not to listen to them. As if I could help listening to them. But she meant well. She always meant well. If it hadn't been for my father, I don't know if I would have been able to leave home and go off to college. He pushed me, insisted that I needed a life of my own. He was right, of course, but at the time I thought he just wanted to be rid of me. He was a very distant man, my father. I never really understood him. Amazingly, I did make my own life. I studied business and met a lovely woman who became my wife. Alice was her name. We come to a corner and wait for a light. Do you mind my telling you all this, Bobby? It feels good to talk. I tell him no, and am struck that this is the first time ever he has called me by my first name. But I am also thinking how weird it is that he's telling me all this, him being a grown-up man and all, and me just a kid. It makes me think that Pam was right about his not having any friends, and that thought makes me sad. I mean, where would I be without the gang of 5? Alice and I lived in Boston, Mr. K goes on. That is, until Father died. I never thought they had much of a marriage, to be quite frank with you, but my mother was beside herself with grief. She always had been a bit frail, and now she just seemed to come apart. Her only sister lives in California. They were never close. So there was no one but you, I put in. The light changes and we start across the street. Me, he says. Yes, indeed, just me. And Alice, of course, but Alice was not happy about the addition of my mother into our lives. No, she was not. And Mother was adamant about not leaving Paintbrush Falls since she'd lived here all her life, so I had no choice but to return, although I assumed that it would be just for a short time. But she became sick, needy. I gave up my job in Boston, went to work at Awkworth and Ames, and Alice left me, didn't she? My mother became my only companion. Life grew small, and time endless. We are walking along Fairlawn Avenue now. I wonder which house is his. I am dying to pee on account of having had a large Coke during my break and not thinking to go to the bathroom since. It is very distracting having to pee this bad when you are listening to somebody pour out their life story. I have just had a thought, Mr. Kellerman says as he starts digging in his pocket. It's quite peculiar. You know how a moment ago I said I never understood my father? Well, here's something, Bobby. I have never truly understood myself. Isn't that a terrible thing to say? I am 45 years old, and I do not understand why I have made the choices I have made. I have always listened to other voices telling me who I am and how I should live. I believed those voices telling me I was a sissy and a mama's boy. I believed my father when he told me I should go away, and I believed my mother when she said that I should come back. I believed Alice when she said I was a coward and not worthy of her love. Over time, the voices became fewer and fewer until there was only my mother's voice, and now her voice is gone. Who is left for me to listen to? He pulls keys out of his pocket as we stop in front of a dark gray house. Yourself, I say, and he looks at me like I've spouted something in a foreign language. I think maybe I have. I think maybe I am spouting a foreign language all the time these days, except that it is really my own language, and I am just learning to speak it. Mr. Kellerman, I say, may I use your bathroom? I've got to pee really, really bad. Mr. Kellerman laughs. Not at me, just because he's surprised, I think. Inside, after I've peed, I am walking down the hall from the bathroom to the living room, and the walls are covered with all these photographs. What amazes me is this. Mr. Kellerman was a kid once. There's a picture of him standing with his parents where he appears to be about my age. He looks happy. Suddenly a light goes on and Mr. K is there, nodding at the picture I'm looking at. My 13th birthday, he says. We had just come from Tucker's. Remember Tucker's? I say yes, knowing that he's referring to the horse farm that burned down a long while back. You like to ride? I asked. Oh, heavens no, I wasn't allowed to ride, he answers. Too dangerous. But I loved horses. Mother and father took me there to feed them, pet them. I knew them all well. I was devastated when that fire occurred, but thank heavens all the horses were saved in time. He looks at me then and says, How sad for you to have lost your mother so young. I shrug, not knowing how to respond. We have both lost our mothers, he sighs. And you know, we have something else in common. Our names. Our names? I say. I'm also Robert. Honest? As if he would be lying. Honest, he says with a smile. He reaches out his hand, which spooks me, and I jump. I just want to shake hands, Bobby, he says, a gesture that I hope will signify a new beginning. I regret my anger toward you, and I thank you for walking home with me and listening. That's okay, I say, and I shake his hand. As I walk the other 2 blocks home, I get to thinking about all that he has told me and about the 2 things we have in common. It is not that I hate Mr. Kellerman, not that I even dislike him anymore, but I can't help it. I hope that those 2 things are all we have in common, and all we ever will.